Wait, they're leaving. The Galactic Council froze when humanity departed the talks. The chamber smelled like nothing Earth had ever produced. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the Grand Conclave Hall on Veth Prime. Not the size of the room, which was enormous enough to swallow 3 football stadiums whole. Not the alien faces watching me from every curved tier of seating that rose toward the vaulted ceiling. Not the soft hum of 62 different translation devices cycling through their startup frequencies. It was the smell, or rather the total absence of any smell I recognized. Clean, flat, neutral air, engineered to offend no biological system in the room. The kind of air that told you, quietly but firmly, that this place had not been built with you in mind. I was Ambassador Nora Callan of the Human Diplomatic Mission, and I had exactly one job on Veth Prime: keep my mouth shut until I knew what I was looking at. My aide, Lieutenant Commander Owen Webb, fell into step half a pace behind my right shoulder, as the usher, a Krathali official wearing deep violet ceremonial wraps, led us down the central aisle. The floor was some kind of dark polished stone that reflected the overhead light like still water. My shoes made a sound with every step. Every other delegation we passed was already seated, and every one of them turned to watch us walk by. Not with curiosity. That would have been easier. They watched us the way you watch a child who has wandered onto a stage mid-performance. Aware that something harmless but disruptive has arrived, mildly amused, already planning how to work around it. Owen leaned close and spoke at a volume only I could catch. Count of visible delegations at front tier, 11. All senior representatives. They came early to be seen arriving. I know, I said quietly. Krathali block is 7 seats strong. That is 2 more aides than the protocol document listed. I noticed. The usher stopped at a curved table, positioned near the far right end of the hall's main floor, close to the wall. Close to the large secondary exit, which was currently sealed but unmistakably present behind us, framed in pale green light. Close to the door. I looked at the seat. Then I looked up at the usher. Is this the position assigned to the Human Diplomatic Mission? I asked. The usher gave a slow, courteous nod that his translation device rendered as, "Correct, Ambassador. As the newest full-status delegation, tradition places your mission at the end of the primary arc, nearest to the exit hall." "Of course," I said. "Thank you." I sat down. Owen took the seat to my right. Our 2 policy advisors, Lena Cross and Sam Ewan, settled in behind us. I set my briefing case on the table, folded my hands on top of it, and looked out at the room. 62 species, millennia of shared history between them, most of which humanity had been absent for. The Krathali at the center front, their towering frames giving them a natural visual dominance even seated. The Solveth Communion, in flowing silver garments, that shifted color with their breathing, iridescent and deliberate. The Dravik Collective in 3 tight rows, uniformly still in a way that no human could have maintained without pharmaceutical assistance. Smaller species filled the upper tiers, some that I recognized from our briefing files, some that even our most thorough xenopolitical library had only partial records on. And at the far end of the arc, separated from the nearest delegation by a noticeable gap of empty table space that I was fairly certain had not been accidental, us. Owen passed me a thin tablet with no words on it, just a number, 17. The count of delegations that had glanced at us since we sat down. I did not respond. I was already watching the room, and I was already building a map in my head of what everyone in it wanted. The session had not yet formally opened. In that window of waiting time before the presiding officer called order, people talked. Aides moved between tables. Small diplomatic courtesies were exchanged. The real political work of any such gathering happens in exactly those moments, in the spaces between official speech, and I had learned in 11 years of alien affairs that watching those spaces was worth more than any briefing document ever written. Here is what I saw. First Voice Orath of the Krathali was speaking to his nearest aide with controlled animation, his secondary pair of arms, the shorter ceremonial ones rarely used in public, making small, precise gestures that their people used when something was either very important or very irritating. Probably both. He had not looked at the human table since we arrived, which was itself a statement. People who do not care about you look at you occasionally by accident. People who are very aware of you make a point of not looking. The Solveth High liaison, A figure our files named as Excellency Voss Miran was speaking to the Krathali block through a personal aid relay, which meant whatever they were saying was not going through the official translation record. An off-record communication between the two largest powers in the room, happening before the session even started. I filed that away. At the upper left tier, two smaller delegations, the Vane and the Karathi, species I had specifically researched because our files contained an unusual note about them, were sitting close together in the physical sense, leaning slightly toward each other's tables, sharing what looked like identical expressions of careful, calibrated worry. Their shipping lanes ran through the Helix corridor. That was in the briefing. What the briefing had not fully emphasized was how clearly that worry was written on their faces even now, before anyone had officially said a word about the corridor. They were afraid of how this was going to end. I understood that feeling, so I made a note. The presiding officer, a neutral species representative called the Chamber Arbiter, currently an elder of the Velhari people, who were not party to the corridor dispute, rose from the central raised platform and struck a tone crystal once. The Grand Conclave of the 62 was in session. The Arbiter spoke first in formal Velhari, which the translation system carried smoothly into whatever language each delegate's earpiece was set to receive. English, for ours, of course. A calm, unhurried welcome, a recitation of the conclave's founding purpose, the standard protocol that I had memorized from the transcripts of 14 previous conclaves, but was hearing live for the first time. Then the formal introduction of the session's primary agenda item. The Helix Corridor, 17 light-years of contested space, rich with triphase mineral deposits that half the species in this room either needed directly or profited from trading. 4 species held partial territorial claims to sections of it. Dozens of others had shipping dependencies on it, and threading directly through the geometric center of the entire corridor, sitting at the only viable refueling point in that entire 17 light-year span, was a human fuel depot. Station Callaway, built 3 years ago. Quietly, legally registered under the New Geneva Accords on Interstellar Infrastructure, which 11 species, including 4 with seats in this room, had signed. Staffed by 47 humans, operational around the clock, already refueling vessels from at least 9 of the delegations present. The Arbiter mentioned Station Callaway in one subordinate clause of the agenda introduction, which was revealing in exactly the way I had expected. When the Arbiter finished and opened the session for initial statements, First Voice Orath stood first. He was very good. I will give him that without any reservation. He had a presence that was genuinely remarkable, tall even by Krathali standards, with the kind of deep, layered vocal delivery that the translation system somehow preserved even when converting it to English. He had a way of pausing at exactly the right moment before his most significant points that made the room lean forward slightly. He spoke for 22 minutes about the corridor, about the history of territorial claims, about the importance of structured resolution, about the need for a framework that served the collective good of all council members. He used the phrase, species with longer experience in interstellar stewardship, 3 times, and each time, he did not look at the human table, which was the most pointed way possible to indicate exactly who he was talking about. He sat down to the Krathali equivalent of applause, which was a low, synchronized hum from their block that the rest of the chamber echoed politely. The Solveth liaison spoke next, shorter, more precise, heavy emphasis on neutral custodianship, protection of all transit rights, the need for an authority body to manage the corridor under council oversight. Then the Dravik spoke through their senior communicant, and their statement was almost startlingly brief. They cared about the northern sections of the corridor. They were not going to say that directly. They were going to say that all claims required equal consideration, and then they sat down. Smaller delegations followed, some with real stakes, some with procedural interests, some, I suspected, simply wanting to be heard on record before the larger powers decided everything. When it came to the human table, Owen touched my arm very lightly, which was our agreed signal for, "Your turn, Ambassador." I stood. "The human diplomatic mission thanks the Arbiter for convening this session," I said. "We are here to participate fully and in good faith in a resolution that serves every species represented in this hall, including those whose shipping lanes and economic networks depend on safe passage through the corridor." I paused there, not because I needed to collect my thoughts, because that pause was where I wanted every senior diplomat in the room to process the words, including those. We look forward to hearing all proposals, I continued, and to contributing our perspective, particularly regarding Station Callaway and the infrastructure commitments humanity has already made in the region. I sat down. 18 seconds. The shortest opening statement in the session. Owen leaned close. Orath's secondary arms just moved. I know, I said. He did not expect short. The Vane ambassador is looking at us. I know that too. What the shortest statement in the room actually communicated was, we are not here to perform. We are here because we have something you need, and we already know it, and we are going to wait for you to figure out what to offer us for it. Every other delegation in that room had used their opening statement to establish position, to state claims, to demonstrate relevance. We had used ours to establish that we did not need to demonstrate relevance. Station Callaway had already done that for us. The first day ended without a resolution proposal being formally tabled. That was normal for conclaves of this type. Groundwork first, assessments and positioning, informal conversations over the long evening social hour, which in Krathali diplomatic tradition lasted 3 hours and involved a great deal of ceremonial beverage sharing. I attended. I was pleasant. I was introduced to 12 delegations by name and made small talk with 7 of them. I let 3 senior Krathali aides talk at me about their homeworld's navigational history for a combined total of 40 minutes, and I was genuinely interested, because I had found that genuine interest was the only kind that actually stuck. 2 things happened in that evening hour that mattered. The first was that the Vane ambassador, a small, quiet person named Delegate Shumai Vel, materialized near my left elbow at almost exactly the moment I was standing alone near the refreshment station between conversations. It was not accidental. She had timed it. I noticed that immediately and liked her for it. "Ambassador Callan," she said, her translation device rendering her voice into English with a soft, slightly echoing quality. "Your statement this morning was brief." "Yes," I said. "Unusually brief, for a first conclave appearance." "I suppose it was." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the room. Then, "The Kurathi ambassador and I have been attending these sessions for a combined 60 years. In that time, we have seen 11 major corridor proposals. None of them have addressed Vane and Kurathi shipping interests in any meaningful way." I looked at her then. "That seems like a significant oversight." "It has been our experience," she said carefully, "that the significant parties in any negotiation tend to address the interests they consider significant. And the Vane and Kurathi do not register as significant." She did not answer that directly. She looked at her beverage. "You have a fuel depot at the center of the corridor." "We do. It serves a great many vessels, including ours." "It does." She looked up at me then, and her eyes, which were slightly too large for her face by human proportions, giving her an expression of permanent attentive alertness, held mine very steadily. "I hope the resolution that comes out of this conclave does not disrupt that service." "I hope so too," I said, and I meant it. And then, very carefully, "If it would be useful, I would welcome the chance to speak with you and Ambassador Kurathi privately about your shipping routes. I would like to understand the full picture of what the corridor means operationally, not just diplomatically." She looked at me for another second. Then she gave a slow nod that was either agreement or gratitude, or both. "Tomorrow evening, I will bring the Kurathi." She moved away. I waited 2 full minutes before I turned to find Owen. "Webb," I said quietly. "I saw," he said. He already had his tablet out. "Send a message to our navigation team on Callaway tonight. I want complete route dependency maps for every vessel currently registered to use our depot, especially Vane and Kurathi flagged ships." "Already typing it," he said. The second thing that happened was smaller and almost easy to miss. At the end of the social hour, as delegations were beginning to filter toward their overnight quarters, I passed within 6 meters of the Dravik Collective's senior communicant, the one who had given their brief statement. His name, per our files, was Elder Dresch. He was speaking to 2 of his own people and not looking at me as I walked past. But his nearest aide was, and that aide gave me a look that I would not have been able to describe precisely to anyone who had not spent years learning to read alien faces. It was not hostile. It was not friendly. It was evaluating. The specific kind of evaluating look that meant, we have noticed something about you that we were not told to notice. I kept walking, but I made a note of that too. The first day had not produced any proposals, any agreements, or any breakthroughs. We had sat in our seat near the door. We had spoken for 18 seconds. We had been ignored by the large powers and quietly approached by two small ones. Back in our quarters that night, while Lena Cross reviewed session transcripts and Sam Ewan cross-referenced trade route data, I sat at the narrow window that looked out over the capital city of Veth Prime and thought about leverage. Not strength, not status, leverage. Strength is what you are. Leverage is what the other person needs from you. The Krathali had enormous strength. So did the Solveth. The Dravik had a kind of cold, patient strength that even the largest delegations treated with careful respect. Humanity had none of those things. We were 43 years out of our home system. Our fleet was growing but not impressive by the standards of this room. Our history in interstellar politics was shorter than some of the species here had been trading with each other. But we had a fuel depot at the center of 17 light-years of contested space, and every ship in that room that operated near the corridor had run its cost calculations around that depot existing. I thought about that for a long time. Then I went to sleep, because I have always believed that a tired diplomat is a bad one. Day 2 went much like day 1, except that I was interrupted 6 times in the formal session instead of none. Progress. First Voice Orath raised the initial framework concept in the afternoon plenary. Very broad strokes. Corridor to be administered under a joint council authority. Claims to be adjudicated by an independent panel using historical precedent. Transit rights to be codified and protected. Infrastructure within the corridor to be brought under council oversight to ensure fair access. That last phrase, infrastructure within the corridor, landed with the specific, careful neutrality of something that had been written and rewritten many times by many advisors. It meant Station Calloway. It meant us. When I requested the floor to respond, the arbiter recognized me. I said 3 sentences: that the human mission was supportive of the principle of fair access, that we welcome discussion of the operational details, and that we would need to understand specifically what council oversight meant before offering a formal position. Orath answered from his seat without requesting the floor, which was a protocol deviation that the arbiter permitted with only a mild reminder about session procedure. He said that oversight would mean an administrative transfer of operational control to a jointly appointed authority, while current operators, he was careful not to say humans, would be retained as technical staff. I said, "We will need time to consult with Earth on a proposal of that scope." He said, "Of course. The Council is flexible on reasonable consultation timelines." He said that very smoothly. I noted it and said nothing further. What "we will consult with Earth" actually meant in our case was, we will not be making any fast decisions under the pressure of your timeline. It was a phrase that sounded cooperative and was actually structural resistance. Every species in that room understood consultation delays. What most of them did not fully appreciate yet was that the humans were not using it as a delay tactic. We were using it as a measuring tool. Every time I said we needed to consult, and every time they pushed back on the timeline, I learned exactly how much they needed our answer quickly. And by day 3, I had a very clear picture of how much that was. Very much indeed. By the end of day 3, I had been interrupted 11 times. Owen was keeping count on the tablet. I had stopped asking him to because I was keeping count in my own head, and I wanted my count and his count to match at the end of each day, to make sure I was not losing detail in the flow of the session. On day 4, the Solveth liaison made a private approach. Not to me directly, through Lena Cross, who was approached during the afternoon break by a Solveth second-tier aide who asked, with elaborate casualness, whether our mission might be available for an informal discussion before the evening session. No agenda. No formal agenda, that is. Just a conversation. I said yes, and sent Lena back with Sam Yuen. They returned 40 minutes later. Sam's expression was the one he got when something had confirmed a theory he had been too cautious to say out loud. "They want to know if we would accept a modified framework," he said, sitting down across from me in our prep room. "One where Calloway stays under human operational control, but with a council liaison embedded in the station's administrative structure. An observer, I said. More than observer. They use the word co-signatory for maintenance and expansion decisions, which means they would have a veto on station development. That reading is available, Sam said carefully. I thought about this. What did they offer in exchange? Lena put her tablet on the table between us. Formal elevation of human diplomatic status to Tier 2 recognition, which gets us longer speaking time in plenary, formal inclusion in pre-session briefings, and a seat on 2 standing council committees. I looked at the tablet. And the Krithali? The Solvith representative was careful not to explicitly mention the Krithali, Sam said. But the proposal had the fingerprints of coordination on it. They knew what the Krithali counterposition would be before I asked. Which meant the 2 largest powers in the room had already negotiated with each other, and were now approaching us together, from 2 separate angles, to make the outcome feel less like a coordinated result than it was. Tell me about the corridor shipping projections again, I said. The ones from our navigation team. Lena pulled them up. I read the numbers. Then I read them again. 17 light years. 1 refueling point. Current traffic through Station Callaway. 412 registered vessels per standard quarter. Projected growth over the next decade if the corridor mineral extraction proceeded as planned. 1,100 vessels per quarter. At the geometric center of the only navigable channel through the disputed zone. I sat back. Webb, I said. Owen was by the door. Ambassador. What does it cost to build a new refueling station in interstellar space from scratch? Comparable to Callaway. He did not look at his tablet. He had already looked at this. 14 to 22 years, depending on materials transport and construction crew availability. Current estimates from the New Geneva Infrastructure Board put the cost at roughly $40 billion in adjusted credits, give or take regional resource pricing. And the corridor would be without an operational facility during that entire period. If Callaway were not operational, yes. I looked at Sam. Sam looked at Lena. Lena was very carefully not expressing anything on her face, which was her way of expressing everything. Send a polite response to the Solvith, I said. Tell them we appreciate the conversation, and will consider it carefully. Do not give them a timeline. And the Krithali formal proposal? Owen asked. Same. I stood up, stretched my back, and looked at the narrow window. Get me the Vane and Karathi route dependency numbers. I want them by tomorrow morning. I did not sleep very well that night, but not because I was worried. I did not sleep well because I was thinking very hard, and thinking very hard has always kept me awake. There is something about the moment when a plan becomes completely clear that produces the specific restlessness of knowing exactly what you are going to do. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. On day 5, I sent a private message to Elder Dresch of the Dravik Collective through their mission's contact address. The message was 4 sentences long. It said that the human mission had noticed the Dravik position on northern corridor access, that we had no competing interest in the northern mineral regions, that we thought it might be productive to speak directly at some point, and that we would leave the timing to them. Then I attended the session and was interrupted 14 more times by First Voice Orath alone. I kept counting. On the morning of the 7th day of the Grand Conclave, First Voice Orath himself appeared at our mission's guest quarters. Not through an aid relay, not through a formal communication request. He came himself, with 2 senior advisors and the Solvith Liaison Excellency Voss Mirren, walking 1 step behind him, wearing the full 8-fold ceremonial sash that Krithali protocol reserved for formal offers. Owen saw them coming on the corridor security feed and had exactly enough time to say, "Ambassador," in a tone that conveyed both the urgency and the significance. And I had exactly enough time to set down my morning beverage and straighten my jacket before they reached our door. I opened it before they knocked, a small thing, but it told them I had been watching for them. First Voice Orath, I said warmly. Excellency Mirren, please come in. Our prep room was not built for 7 people, but we made it work. Lena and Sam arranged themselves near the back wall. Owen stood by the door. Orath and Mirren took the 2 seats at the table across from me, and their advisors remained standing. I had set out cups on the table that morning. Warm drinks, our supply of Earth origin tea, which meant something to me personally, and meant almost nothing to them nutritionally, but which carried a quality that I had learned alien diplomats found difficult to classify. Offering something they could not categorize put them in the small but real position of having to decide how to respond to an unknown gesture. Orath accepted the cup. He looked at it for a moment, and then held it with both of his primary hands. Mirren accepted hers and set it on the table in front of her without looking at it. "Ambassador Callan," Orath began, and his voice had the layered quality that I had spent 7 days studying. "We felt it was appropriate to move beyond the formality of the session floor for a more direct exchange." "I appreciate that," I said. "I think direct conversations are usually more productive." "Indeed." He settled in his seat, which for a Krathali involved a minor realignment of his secondary shoulders that I had learned meant he was preparing to say something he had rehearsed. "The Council has been discussing the human mission's position, and there is a general feeling that the time has come to bring the question of Station Calloway to the center of the conversation, rather than leaving it in the background." "That seems reasonable," I said. "We are prepared," he continued, "to offer the human diplomatic mission a formal protected partnership designation. This is the highest diplomatic classification available to species within their first century of interstellar engagement." He paused. "It would formalize humanity's relationship with the Council in a way that has not been offered to any species this quickly in 400 years of recorded conclave history." Mirren spoke then, quietly and precisely. "The Solvith Communion joins this offer. Together, the Krathali-Solvith proposal includes guaranteed safe passage rights for human vessels through the corridor, secured fuel contract agreements for Station Calloway at current rates for a period of 30 years, and inclusion of the human mission in the Standing Council Trade Liaison Committee." I listened to all of this without writing anything down. I looked at them while they spoke. I let the silence settle for a moment after Mirren finished. "And in exchange?" I said. Orath placed his cup down very carefully. "Administrative custody of Station Calloway would transfer to the newly formed Corridor Joint Authority. Human technical and operational staff would remain in place. Contractual employment would be guaranteed." I nodded slowly, as though I was weighing this. I had already weighed it. I had weighed it at 2 in the morning 4 nights ago, when I first understood where this conversation was going. I had run the numbers with Sam and Lena and Owen. I had spoken with Earth on a secure line, not to ask permission, but to confirm that what I was considering was within my authority, as ambassador to execute without delay. It was. The offer on the table was genuinely good. By any objective measurement of what humanity had walked into this conclave hoping to achieve, it exceeded expectations. Protected partnership was real. The Trade Committee seat was real. 30 years of secured fuel contracts was real. And they were offering it because they needed us, which meant something I had been calculating very carefully for 7 days. If they needed us enough to offer all of this, then what they actually needed from us was worth considerably more than what they were offering. And if they needed us this much at the table, what would they need us when we were not at the table? I looked at Orath. He was watching me with the expression of someone who has laid out an excellent hand of cards and is waiting for the other player to fold. "I appreciate the depth of this proposal," I said, "and I want to be clear that we regard it seriously. It reflects a genuine effort to find common ground, and I do not take that lightly." He began to relax very slightly. "However," I said, and his relaxation stopped, "a decision of this nature, the administrative transfer of human-built infrastructure, representing a significant investment of human resources, and occupying a position of this strategic importance, requires full consultation with Earth, not as a formality, as a genuine democratic process. Our government's oversight structures require it." Mirren's eyes moved to me in a way that was very controlled. "We would need," I continued, "at minimum 1 week, more likely 10 days. Orath's expression did not change visibly, but his secondary arms moved. Not the large, deliberate gesture I had seen him use in the plenary, a small movement, an involuntary one. "The conclave's formal session timeline is not that flexible," he said carefully. "The session was convened for a 2-week period. We are at the midpoint." "I understand," I said, "and I am sorry that our consultation requirements do not align more conveniently with the session structure. But I am sure the Council, which governs 62 species with 62 different governmental structures, has provisions for exactly this kind of timing difference." He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. Then he said, with great care, "Is there any aspect of the proposal that might allow for a faster response? A point of principle we might clarify that would simplify your consultation process?" And this was the moment I had been building toward for 7 days, because this question, this specific question, asked this way, by the most senior diplomat of the largest single power in the room, told me with perfect clarity that they were not in a position to wait. "I do not think there is anything that would simplify the consultation," I said pleasantly. "It is a thorough process, but I want to assure you that we are taking it very seriously and that we will be in touch as soon as we have something to bring back to the table." We exchanged a few more courtesies. They finished or did not finish their tea. They left. Owen closed the door behind them and turned to me. I was already looking at the small framed picture I had put on our prep room wall. Not for decoration. It was a photograph of Station Callaway, taken from 2 kilometers out, the depot's 3 arms catching the light of the corridor's nearest star, the docking bays arranged in their neat geometric pattern around the central hub. 47 humans, 1 fuel depot, 17 light-years of contested space. "They do not have 10 days, Owen said. "No," I said. "They have about 2. Before what? Before the Dravik figure out that they can get better terms by not agreeing to the Krathali-Solvith framework. The Dravik want the northern veins. Orath and Mirren have been managing that interest without letting it become a formal demand, because a formal Dravik demand breaks their coalition. But the Dravik are patient, not blind. They will see what is happening." Owen was quiet. "And when the coalition starts to crack," I continued, "the whole framework starts to crack with it, which means Orath and Mirren have about 2 days to close a deal before they have to start renegotiating their own agreement with each other from scratch." Sam exhaled slowly. "So we wait." "We do not wait," I said. "We consult with Earth, thoroughly, democratically." I picked up my jacket. "And tomorrow morning in the session, we ask very polite and very detailed questions about the administrative structure of the proposed Corridor Joint Authority, which will take the rest of the day to answer inadequately." Lena Cross, who had been silent through all of this, looked up from her tablet and said quietly, "You knew from day one that we were going to walk out of this." I looked at her. "Did you?" she said. "I knew we were going to need the option," I said, "and I wanted to make sure, before we ever needed to use it, that there was somewhere to walk to." She nodded slowly. "Callaway." "Callaway," I confirmed. I put on my jacket, straightened the collar, and looked at the picture on the wall one more time. Then I went to the session and asked questions for 4.5 hours, and was interrupted 16 more times, and wrote down every single one. On day 8, the evening before what I had already decided would be the critical session, I met privately with Delegate Shumai Vel and the Kurathi ambassador in a small meeting room that the Vane delegation had reserved. The Kurathi ambassador, whose name was Delegate Po Rin Sar, was a tall, narrow-framed individual who gave the impression of having spent a great deal of his career in rooms where his opinion was asked last, if at all. He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who was not sure yet what category to put me in. I did not blame him for that. "I want to be direct with you both," I said, after we had established that the conversation was being conducted outside the official translation record. "I have read everything that has been written about Vane and Karathi shipping in relation to the corridor, and I have spoken with our depot team at Callaway about the routes your vessels run. You are both operationally dependent on the corridor, in ways that the current framework does not address." Delegate Vel looked at me without expression. "That is accurate. The language in the current draft," I said, "under the section on existing shipping access, uses the phrase, ongoing consideration of established routes. That language has no binding mechanism. There is no enforcement provision. It means the new joint authority can recognize that your routes exist, and then make decisions that affect those routes without any formal obligation to prioritize your operational continuity." Delegate Poe was very still. "You have read the draft more carefully than most parties in this session," he said. It was not a compliment, so much as a fact, presented with faint surprise. "I read it several times," I said. Delegate Vel put her hands on the table, in a gesture that I had learned in our earlier conversations, was her way of signaling that she was about to say something that mattered to her. "Ambassador Callan, what are you proposing?" "I am not proposing anything yet," I said. "I am telling you what I see." And what I see is that the two of you have been in this conclave for 8 days, watching two large powers build a framework for a resource that your ships cross every month, and neither of those powers has come to your table with anything that gives you real protection. Poe looked at Vel. Vel looked at Poe. They have not come to our table at all, Poe said. I said, I know. Another moment of quiet. Whatever happens in the formal session tomorrow, I said, I want you to know that the human mission has made an internal commitment regarding Station Calloway and its services to Vane and Karathi registered vessels. That commitment exists regardless of what the conclave decides, because Calloway is our facility, and we operate it according to our own standards. What commitment? Vel asked. No disruption to your registered routes, without 60 days written notice, and a formal alternatives assessment, conducted jointly with your missions, I said. That commitment will be registered under the New Geneva Infrastructure Accords before the end of this conclave, regardless of the treaty outcome. Poe was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. Why? He said. Not suspicious. Genuinely curious. We have nothing to offer you in this negotiation. You have exactly two things, I said. You have the ability to speak to the arbiter independently about your concerns with the current framework, which creates a procedural record that affects what the framework can claim as consensus. And you have the ability to be present tomorrow in the session in a way that signals that the coalition is not as complete as it appears. Vel was very quiet. You want us to be visible, she said. I want you to be what you already are, I said. Parties with real stakes who have not been genuinely included. You do not have to do anything except continue being that, visibly, in the room where it matters. Poe made a small sound that his translation device rendered as a neutral acknowledgement. And what do you get from this? A more honest room, I said. That is what I want. A room where the conversation matches the reality, which is that a corridor agreement that does not protect the interests of everyone who depends on the corridor is not a durable agreement. They looked at each other for a longer moment this time. Vel said, We will be in the session tomorrow. Good, I said. I would expect nothing else. We concluded the meeting shortly after. I walked back to our mission quarters with Owen, through the long, pale corridors of the conclave facility, under the slightly blue-tinted lights that I had almost gotten used to. You told them nothing about what you are planning for tomorrow, Owen said. No, because if they knew, it would change the way they behave. If they knew, they would have to decide whether to endorse what I am planning. That is not a decision they should have to make. What they should do is exactly what they said they would do. Be present. Be genuine. Be the thing they already are. I am not asking them to perform a strategy. I am asking them to show up. Owen considered this, and if they do not show up, then they do not show up, and we proceed without that element. The core decision does not depend on them, but it would be better with them. Most things are better when the people who are genuinely affected are in the room, I said. That is a general principle, and also a specific calculation for tomorrow. We reached our quarters. Lena had already prepared the final briefing summary for the morning session. Sam had a revised version of the framework document, with every point of concern highlighted in a system that only our team used, which meant I could read it in under 10 minutes and know exactly where the problems lived. I read it. Then I looked at the picture of Calloway on the wall. Then I went to sleep. In the morning, I ate breakfast with unusual care and dressed with the specific attention to detail that I only apply on days when I know that every small signal will be read. The human diplomatic mission's formal dress is not impressive by galactic standards. It is a dark blue uniform with a small Earth flag pin on the collar, and the mission seal on the right cuff. No ceremonial sash, no rank insignia beyond the ambassador's designation on the lapel. Clean, simple, direct. I had chosen that deliberately when I was designing the mission's visual standards 2 years before we ever came to Veth Prime. We were not going to look old. We were not going to try to look impressive by the standards of species who had been doing this for millennia. We were going to look like what we were, a young species that was present, prepared, and paying attention. I looked at the mirror in our quarters before we left. I looked, I decided, exactly like someone who was about to do something that a room full of ancient civilizations had not planned for. That would do. Owen, I said. Ambassador, get me a channel to Calloway before we go into the session. 5 minutes. I want to brief Captain Rhea. He opened the channel. Rhea appeared on the small screen, in her station workwear, the low gravity of Calloway giving her movements a slight efficiency that space workers develop over time. Rhea, I said, we are going into the formal session shortly. I want you to know that whatever happens today, Calloway continues regular operations. No changes, no communications about any changes. If anyone contacts you directly from any delegation asking about our operational status, you refer them to my office. She looked at me steadily. Anything I should know about the session? We are going to do something that has not been done before in this chamber, I said. And after we do it, things may move quickly. I want Calloway stable and quiet while they do. Calloway is always stable, she said. I know, I said. That is why I built it with people like you on it. She gave me a short nod. Good luck, Ambassador. Thank you, Captain. The channel closed. I picked up my briefing case, looked at the photograph of Calloway one more time, and walked out the door with my team behind me. The session was about to begin, and for the first time in 9 days, I was the one looking forward to it. The thing about walking out of a room is that everyone in the room has to decide, in the first 2 seconds after you do it, what it means. That is where the real moment lives, not in the walking, in the deciding. I had spent 7 days studying the 62 delegations in that chamber. 7 days of formal sessions, evening social hours, quiet corridor conversations, intercepted glances, off-record aid communications that I was not supposed to notice but did, and the one private meeting where First Voice Orath had come to our quarters himself, with the Solvith liaison at his side, and a formal offer that was designed to feel generous. By day 9, I knew what every major player in that room wanted, what they were afraid of, and, most usefully, what none of them had planned for. The formal session on day 9 began at standard morning hour. All delegations present. The arbiter called order. First Voice Orath submitted the corridor partition framework for formal first reading. This was the next step in the procedural sequence, the moment where the vague outlines of a coalition agreement became actual written language, entered into the official session record. I had read the framework the night before. Sam had a copy through the Solvith Advanced Distribution, which was technically proper procedure for circulating pre-session documents, but which had arrived at our table 14 hours later than it had arrived at every other senior delegation's table. An oversight, I was sure. The framework gave the Krathali the southern mineral shelf. It gave the Solvith custodianship of the transit corridor. It gave the Dravik quiet, non-enumerated access to the northern mineral regions through a clause about open extraction rights in unclaimed subsections, which was designed to be enough to keep them from formally objecting without actually naming what they were getting. The Vane and Karathi received a 2-paragraph section about ongoing recognition of established shipping routes that contained no binding language whatsoever. And in subsection 7, buried between procedural language about administrative appointment schedules, Station Calloway was described as undergoing a transitional administrative transfer to the Corridor Joint Authority within 90 days of treaty ratification, with operational continuity maintained through contracted technical staff. It was clean. It was thorough. It was the kind of document that takes months to write and looks inevitable once it exists. I read it the night before, and I ate dinner afterward, and I slept 7 hours. And in the morning I came to the session knowing exactly what I was going to do and exactly what I needed to make sure of before I did it. The morning before the session I had sent 2 messages. The first was to Delegate Shu Mai Vel of the Vane and her counterpart, Ambassador Po Rin Sar of the Karathi. The message was brief. It said that the human mission had reviewed the framework document, that we had noted the absence of binding shipping protections for Vane and Karathi routes, and that regardless of what happened in today's session, we wanted them to know that Station Calloway's services to their flagged vessels would not be interrupted without their advance notice. That was a promise. It was also the first concrete promise anyone had made to them in 7 days of high-level negotiations about a corridor that their ships ran through every standard month. The second message was to Elder Dresh of the Dravik. It was 3 words. We see you. Dravik diplomatic culture, per the files I had read 3 times, placed enormous value on acknowledgement, not agreement, not alliance, just the recognition that you had been seen as a thinking entity with interests worth noticing. 3 words, in that context, carried more weight than most people would imagine. I arrived at the session and took my seat near the door. Owen and Lena and Sam arranged themselves. I set my briefing case on the table. The arbiter opened the formal first reading of the framework. Orath presented it. He was excellent, as always. He spoke for 26 minutes, the longest he had gone in any single session address. He laid out the framework's provisions with the practiced ease of someone who has negotiated something complex and is now translating it into the language of inevitability. "This is the resolution," his whole manner said. "This is the shape the future takes. We have been responsible stewards of the process, and here is the result." The chamber received it well. Most delegations were nodding in their species-specific equivalent of the gesture. The smaller parties in the upper tiers were quiet, which was either agreement or resignation, or some combination. When he finished, the arbiter opened the floor for responses. I watched the sequence of delegations who signaled, 3 from the upper tiers, in order of seniority. I would not be called before them. That was fine. The first response was broadly supportive. The second raised a minor procedural concern about timeline. The third was the Kurathi ambassador, Delegate Po Rin Sar. He stood and spoke for 4 minutes about shipping lane protections, in the measured, careful tone of someone who has been in this position before and knows that raising objections is necessary but unlikely to change anything. But he was standing. He was speaking. He was on the record. And Delegate Vel, at the vein table across the upper tier, was watching with the alert stillness of someone who had decided, sometime in the hours since our meeting the night before, that she had been quiet for 60 years, and that being quiet had not served her. When Poe sat down, Orath began to respond, and that was when I stood up. Standing during another delegate's response was technically within the rules. It was rare, because it was a signal. It meant you were requesting priority recognition as the next speaker, which the arbiter could grant or hold, based on procedural judgment. The arbiter looked at me. I waited. The arbiter said, "The human mission requests recognition." I had been standing for 8 seconds. I counted. "Thank you, arbiter," I said. My translation device carried it cleanly through the hall. "The human mission has reviewed the corridor partition framework submitted this morning." Orath had paused his response. He was watching me now. This was the first time in 9 days that he had looked at the human table with his full attention. I kept my voice level and clear. "We have significant concerns about the provisions of subsection 7 regarding Station Callaway. The framework characterizes our infrastructure as subject to administrative transfer without addressing the terms of that transfer, the basis on which it is justified under current treaty law, or the specific protections for our operational staff and contractual commitments." No one interrupted me. That was new. That was 9 days of being interrupted 17 times, and now no one was interrupting me, and the silence in that chamber had a texture to it that I could feel. "The human mission is not able to participate in a formal first reading of this framework without those concerns being addressed," I said. "We have requested consultation time, which is our right under conclave procedure. We have not received a substantive response to our concerns, and the framework as written does not treat the question of human-built infrastructure as a matter for negotiation. It treats it as a settled premise." I picked up my briefing case. It is a very ordinary thing, picking up a briefing case. People pick things up all the time. In a room full of alien diplomats watching every movement a human makes, picking up a briefing case in the middle of a formal session statement is not ordinary at all. The chamber felt it. "The human mission is withdrawing from this session," I said, "pending the establishment of a framework for genuine negotiation that includes human interests as equal participants, rather than as terms to be managed." I walked toward the door. Later, I would hear from 6 different accounts that the silence lasted 7 seconds from the moment I began walking until the moment Orath spoke. 7 full seconds. In a room with equipment monitoring atmospheric conditions, translation array outputs, and chair pressure sensors for comfort calibration, the technical record shows a flat line across every ambient noise measurement for exactly that duration. 62 species, plus their combined staff of hundreds, making no sound. "Ambassador Callan," Orath's voice was very steady. That impressed me, genuinely. "The session is still in progress." I stopped at the door. I turned around. He was standing. He did not look like someone who was used to standing up in situations where his posture was primarily defensive, but he was working with what he had. "I know," I said. I held his gaze for a moment. "We will be at Station Calloway. When the Council is ready to discuss a framework that genuinely includes us, we will be ready to listen." And I said, "To the room," not to him specifically, to the Arbiter, and to the Solveth Liaison, and to the Dravik Elder, and to the small vein delegate in the upper tier who was watching me with the careful expression of someone who is reassessing something very quickly. "Calloway is open. We will continue servicing all registered vessels. We are not trying to disrupt anything. We are trying to be in the room as real participants." And then I turned and walked through the door with Owen a half step behind me, and Sam and Lena 2 paces after that, and the door sealed behind us, with the Krathali corridor's standard soft lock sound, and we walked. Owen waited until we were 40 meters from the chamber. "You told them Calloway is open," he said. "Yes. Which is not the same as suspending operations." "Correct. But Orath will hear it as a potential suspension. He will hear it as a possibility, which is not the same as a fact, but a possibility they have to plan for is often more motivating than a fact they have simply accepted." Owen was quiet for a few steps. "And if they call the possibility and test whether Calloway is actually still open, then it will still be open," I said, "because I am not going to put vessels in danger trying to cross 17 light-years of space by cutting off their fuel supply without notice. That is not something we are going to do." "But you are not going to say that yet." "I am not going to clarify what I did not make unclear," I said. "There is a difference between being ambiguous and being misleading. I said Calloway is open. That is true. What they hear in the space around that statement is not my responsibility." Sam said from behind me, "That is a very precise line." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. And we are going to stay on the right side of it." We kept walking. Behind us, through the corridor's acoustic insulation, I could hear the chamber beginning to produce noise again. The kind of noise that 62 different species simultaneous urgent consultation produces when all of it starts at once. It sounded like a room discovering that it had not actually thought of everything. We reached our mission quarters. Owen sealed the room. I sat down, set my briefing case on the table, and looked at the photograph of Station Calloway on the wall. "Get me a channel to Calloway," I said. "I want Captain Rhea on the line in the next 20 minutes. "Already opening it," Sam said. "And someone tell Earth we have formally withdrawn from the session and will have a progress update within 48 hours. Lena looked up. "Progress update? We have just walked out of the most significant conclave session humanity has ever attended." "Yes," I said, "which is progress." She held my gaze for a second. Then the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was on its way to becoming one. "Progress," she said. "Progress," I confirmed. The call to Station Calloway took 11 minutes to connect, which was standard for the distance involved, and I used those 11 minutes to review everything I knew about Captain Ruth Rhea. She had been at Calloway since the station opened. Former deep space construction crew, transferred to depot operations when Calloway shifted from building phase to operational phase 2 years ago. She had been the one to officially register the station's first refueling of a non-human vessel, a mid-size vein cargo transport, which I noted with some satisfaction, was the same species whose delegate had met me quietly at the social hour. She had a reputation, per every file on the station I had read, for being extremely good at her job and extremely direct about what that job required. When the channel opened, she appeared on the screen with the slightly tired expression of someone who has been doing calculations. "Ambassador Callan," she said, "I was told to expect this call. Captain Rhea, thank you for taking it promptly. We have been watching the session records," she said. "Owen Webb sends us daily summaries." She glanced to the side, where someone on her end was evidently providing information, "and we just received the live feed of this morning's session. The walkout is already circulating on every xenopolitical news relay I monitor. How many vessels are currently docked or scheduled to dock at Calloway in the next standard week?" She looked at something off-screen. 41 docked, or in approach queue, scheduled for the next 7 days, another 72. That is across 9 species, if you count the Dravik research vessel that came through yesterday, and has not filed a departure plan yet. I looked at Owen. Owen made a note. The Dravik vessel is still at your station? Arrived 43 hours ago. Filed for fuel and atmospheric maintenance. Has not called for departure clearance yet. Rhea tilted her head very slightly. I had noticed that. Keep me informed of any changes there. I looked back at the screen. Captain, I want you to do 2 things for me. First, continue all regular operations, exactly as normal. No changes, no disruptions, no signals that anything unusual is happening. Easy enough. What is the second thing? Send me your complete network of regular customers, not just names. I want the operational profiles. What they carry, where they are going, how often they come through, what their alternatives are if Callaway is unavailable. She looked at me steadily. You want to know who cannot afford to lose us. I want to understand the full picture, I said carefully. Same thing. She was already pulling files. I will have it to you in 2 hours. There is one piece you should probably see first, though. What is that? The Krathali fleet element that has been holding position 18 light-years out since before the conclave started. 3 capital-class vessels. They have been quiet for 9 days. Their transponder check-ins come through our relay network, which means they route through our station's communication array. I was very still. They route through your array. Standard protocol for deep space positioning. It is in their navigation agreement, signed before the conclave started. She raised her eyebrows very slightly. Their last scheduled check-in is in 31 hours. If they do not receive relay confirmation from Callaway by then, it triggers an emergency repositioning protocol. They would have to burn significant fuel to reroute through the alternate relay chain. I looked at Owen. Owen was looking at me with the expression he got when a piece of information arrived that was both surprising and, on reflection, completely logical. You did not know that, Rhea said. It was not quite a question. I knew the fleet element was out there, I said. I did not know about the relay dependency. Most people do not think about the communication infrastructure, she said. They think about fuel. But we are also the relay hub for that section of the corridor. 3 separate fleet elements use us for deep space communication. All 3 have timing protocols. I let out a slow breath. Station Callaway was not just a fuel depot at the center of 17 light-years of contested space. It was also a communications relay hub. It was also the checkpoint for 3 fleet elements positioning protocols. It was also the registered home port of 41 vessels currently in queue. We had not built the most important single installation in the Helix corridor intentionally. Exactly. We had built it because the geometry made sense and the economics worked. But we had built it in the right place, at the right time, for reasons that turned out to be more significant than anyone, including us, had fully appreciated. Captain Rhea, I said, please send me everything. Already sending, she said. And Ambassador? Yes? She looked at me with the direct expression of someone who has been very far from home for a long time and has stopped being polite about things that matter. How long is this going to take? I do not know exactly, I said honestly. But not long. I do not think anyone in that room can afford long. She nodded once, slowly. Good. I have 41 vessels in queue, and 23 crew members, who have questions I cannot fully answer yet. Sooner is better. Understood. I will keep you informed. The channel closed. Owen was already pulling up the data packet Rhea had sent. Lena was looking at the communications relay maps, the ones that showed Callaway's position, not just as a fuel point, but as a nexus in the corridor's deep space network. Sam was on a separate line to our navigation team. I walked to the window and looked out at the capital of Veth Prime. It was a city that had been standing for 30,000 years, longer than that if you counted the settlements that existed before the current government. Older than humanity's written history by a factor that was difficult to hold in your mind all at once. Orath's people had been in space when humans were still arguing about whether the sun moved around the Earth. And yet here we were, in their capital, and they needed us to not leave. Not because we were stronger, not because we had more history, or more fleets, or more status in the Council's long ledger of precedent and seniority. Because we had put something in the right place at the right time, and we had been patient enough to let the moment come to us, instead of forcing it. My communication device chimed. A text message, through the secure conclave diplomatic channel, sender identified as Dravik Collective Mission, Elder Dresh. Personal. I opened it. It said, "We received your message. We see you also. When you are ready to speak, we are ready to listen." I read it twice. Then I smiled in the way I only let myself smile when nobody is watching, which is the only really genuine smile I have. "Owen," I said without turning from the window. "Ambassador? Set up a channel to Elder Dresh for tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else's day starts." "Done. And send a message back through the same channel. Tell him, 'Thank you. Tomorrow morning works well. We look forward to it.'" "Anything else?" I thought for a moment. "Tell Rhea to keep the Dravik vessel comfortable. Whatever they need. Good maintenance service. No delays on their atmospheric work. Make them feel welcome." I heard Owen typing. "Ambassador," Sam said from across the room. He was looking at his screen with the particular stillness he got when numbers were doing something important. "I have been looking at the relay protocols Captain Rhea mentioned. The Krathali Fleet Elements check-in is 31 hours from now. But there are 2 other fleet elements in the region. One Solvith, one," he paused, "one that is listed in our navigation files as Dravik registered." I turned from the window. "The Dravik have a fleet element out there too?" "Small one. 4 vessels. Listed as a geological survey operation." He looked up at me. "They are also routing through Callaway's relay network." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Lena said very quietly, "The Dravik vessel at Callaway. It has not filed a departure plan." "No," I said. "And Elder Dresh just sent you a personal message within 2 hours of us walking out of the session." "Yes." "And their fleet element in the corridor is relay dependent on Callaway." "Yes." Lena set down her tablet. "They are not surveying geology." "No," I agreed. "Probably not. They are watching." "They have been watching," I said, "this entire conclave, waiting to see where things land before they commit to anything. And when we walked out of that room today, every watching party in the corridor just had to recalculate." Owen looked up from his own screen. "How many parties are watching that we have not identified yet?" It was a good question. "I do not know," I said. "But I think the next 31 hours are going to tell us a great deal about that." I sat back down at the table, opened the data packet from Rhea, and started reading. 41 vessels, 72 scheduled, 3 fleet elements on relay dependency, 1 Dravik geological survey that was not a geological survey, 1 ancient chamber full of 62 species who had spent 7 days treating us like a minor inconvenience, and were now, I was fairly certain, experiencing the specific sensation of understanding that they had miscalculated. I read everything Rhea had sent me. Then I made a list. Not of what we wanted, not of what we were going to demand, a list of what every party in this situation actually needed, written out plainly, without the diplomatic language that turns needs into positions, and turns positions into the kind of rigid structures that break negotiations instead of completing them. The Krathali needed the southern mineral shelf, and they needed their fleet elements relay check-in in 31 hours. The Solveth needed transit corridor custodianship, and they needed the legitimacy that came from a settlement that everyone signed. The Dravik needed the northern mineral access they had been maneuvering toward for 3 years, without ever stating directly, and they needed to know that a deal was possible before their survey fleet gave up and burned fuel going home. The Vane and the Kurathi needed their shipping lanes protected with language that was actually binding, and they needed someone to treat that as a real requirement, rather than a clause to add in the last paragraph to make the document look inclusive. And we needed Callaway to remain ours, truly ours, not ours in a technical staff sense while someone else made the decisions. We needed a seat at the real table, not near the door. I looked at the list. None of these needs were actually in conflict with each other. That was the thing nobody in that chamber had said out loud, possibly because they had been too busy protecting their positions to map the actual needs underneath them. The Krathali, getting the southern shelf, did not require humanity losing Callaway. The Solveth custodianship of transit lanes did not require the Dravik to give up the northern access they had been quietly working toward. The Vane and Kurathi getting binding shipping protections did not cost anyone anything except the effort of writing better language. The whole thing was solvable. I had known it was solvable since day 3. That was not the interesting part. The interesting part was, It was only solvable if we were in the room as actual participants. And the only way to guarantee that was to make clear, precisely and without apology, that being left out of the negotiation was not something we were going to accept. Hence, the door. The call with Elder Dresch happened at first light, Veth prime time, which translated to roughly 4 in the morning by the internal clock my body still ran on despite 9 days in an alien time zone. I had asked Owen to set it early for a reason. People are different in the early hours. The performance layer is thinner. The things that matter are more visible. Elder Dresch appeared on the screen in what appeared to be a working space rather than a formal meeting area. Functional, with the characteristic Dravik aesthetic of everything having a place and being in it. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. He was older than I had realized from across the chamber floor. His coloring had the muted quality that their files described as the marker of someone who had moved past ambition into something quieter and more durable. His eyes were dark and still. "Ambassador Callan," he said. His translation device rendered his voice without the echo quality I had noticed in the Krethali or Solveth devices. Direct, unornamented. "Elder Dresch," I said, "thank you for responding to my message, and for this call. Your message was honest," he said. "We appreciate that more than most species appreciate honesty. It is not always comfortable, but it is efficient." "I agree," I said. "I will try to stay in that spirit now. Please." I looked at him through the screen. The Dravik position in the corridor negotiation has been clear in what it signals, and careful in what it states. You want access to the northern mineral regions. Not custodianship, not administrative control. Practical access. Open extraction rights that do not require ongoing permission from whoever ends up managing the rest of the corridor. He was still. The Krethali Solvith framework gives you something approximating that in subsection 4, I continued. But it makes it contingent on a quarterly review by the Joint Authority, which gives whoever controls that authority a recurring veto over your operations. "You read it carefully," he said. "I read it 3 times. He looked at me for a moment. "You walked out of the session yesterday." "Yes." Most new species treat their first conclave appearance as a learning exercise. They observe. They build relationships. They do not create procedural situations. "We are not most new species," I said. And then, because he had said he appreciated honesty, we walked in knowing what we had. We spent 9 days confirming that everyone else knew it too. When the framework appeared without including us as real participants, we made a decision. To leave. To go somewhere worth being. He made a small sound that his translation device did not render into any English equivalent, which meant it was something his people did that did not map onto human vocabulary. From the context, I chose to read it as agreement. "What do you want from this conversation?" he asked. "I want to understand whether the Dravik would support a revised framework, one that addresses your access rights directly and explicitly, rather than implicitly and conditionally, and one that treats Station Callaway as a permanently human-administered facility with joint oversight, rather than a transferred asset. Those are 2 different questions." "They are," I said. "Your support of the second one is not a condition for getting the first one. I am not asking for a trade. I am asking if you think a better framework is possible and whether you would be willing to say so." He was quiet for several seconds. In Dravik culture, per the files I had read, silence of this duration is not hesitation. It is the visible portion of active thinking, and interrupting it is considered not just rude, but genuinely counterproductive. I waited. "The Dravik Collective," he said finally, "has observed 47 conclaves addressing various disputes involving the corridor region and adjacent territories. In 43 of those conclaves, the final framework disadvantaged species that did not belong to the founding coalition. In 4 conclaves, the outcome was genuinely multilateral. In all 4 of the multilateral outcomes, the process was disrupted by an unexpected factor that forced the major powers to renegotiate." I looked at him. "What were the unexpected factors?" "In the first case," he said, "a geological survey revealed that the claimed mineral deposits did not exist where the framework assumed they did." A pause. "In the second, a key transit route became impassable due to stellar activity, changing all the shipping dependencies." Another pause. "In the third, a species that had been considered a minor party turned out to hold an unregistered claim on a critical infrastructure point. He stopped there. And the fourth? I said. The fourth, he said, was the one we remember most. A small delegation walked out of the formal session and established that they could not be ignored. It took 6 days for the coalition to invite them back on genuinely equal terms. I let that sit. 6 days, I said. 6 days, he confirmed. Elder Dresch, I said, would the Dravik Collective be willing to submit a formal statement to the Arbiter, expressing support for a review of the framework before it proceeds to first reading, on the grounds that the current draft does not adequately address the interests of several represented parties? He looked at me steadily. That statement would require us to formally identify which interests were inadequately addressed. Yes. It would reveal the specifics of our position on Northern Access, which we have kept deliberately general. Yes, I said. I know that, and I know what that costs you strategically. I am not asking for it without understanding what I am asking. He was silent again. In exchange, I said, and I had thought about this wording very carefully, I would like to make a commitment, not a trade, a commitment. Regardless of what happens in this conclave, Station Callaway will prioritize Dravik operational access to the northern regions without requiring joint authority review or approval. That commitment would be in writing, under the New Geneva Infrastructure Accords, binding and registered. Elder Dresch looked at me for a long time. You can make that commitment unilaterally, he said. Station Callaway is a human facility, under human administrative authority, I said. We can make our own operational agreements with any vessel or extraction operation that uses our services. It does not require council approval. The joint authority proposal would change that. Which is why we are not accepting the joint authority proposal as currently written, I said simply. Another silence. This one was longer. Then, I will speak with my delegation. Of course. Take whatever time you need. You should know, he said, with the particular directness I was beginning to understand as just how Dravik people sounded when they were being genuine, that your vessel at my home port has also not filed a departure plan. I did not let my expression change. I was not aware we had a vessel at. The Dravik have no home port in this system, he said, with something that might have been dry humor, but we do have a research vessel currently docked at Station Callaway. My third-tier navigator has been receiving very good maintenance service. We appreciate it. So he knew about the Dravik vessel at Callaway. Of course he did, and he knew that I knew about it, and he was letting me know that he knew, which completed a small loop of mutual acknowledgement. Callaway serves everyone well, I said. So I understand, he said. Ambassador Callan, my delegation will consider your proposal. We will have an answer before the formal session opens. I look forward to it. The channel closed. I sat back. My cup of tea had gone cold again. I picked it up anyway and drank it, which tasted exactly like what cold tea always tastes like, and which I found weirdly comforting. Owen appeared in the doorway. He had been in the next room during the call, listening but not visible on screen. The Dravik support a formal review request, he said. They will push for it. Probably, I said. Which breaks the coalition. Which creates a crack in it, I said. Whether the coalition breaks depends on what Orath does when the crack appears. What do you think he will do? I thought about Orath, about 9 days of watching him, about the evening social hour where he had accepted tea from us, and the private meeting in our quarters, where he had come himself rather than sending an aide, about the way his secondary arms moved when something surprised him, and the fact that he had sent Mirren with him to our quarters rather than keeping the approach Krathali only, which meant he understood the value of a coalition presentation even in a moment he was trying to frame as personal. He will come here, I said. How soon? Before the Dravik statement is filed with the Arbiter. He is watching Dresch too. He will know before we do, if Dresch is moving. Owen looked at me. And when he comes, I said, we are going to have a very honest conversation about what this resolution actually requires. Without the performance. Without the translation device, smoothing everything over. Just the truth of what everyone needs. And what it costs. I stood up, stretched, and looked at the photograph of Callaway on the wall. Get me Rhea again, I said. I want to brief her before the Fleet Elements relay check-in. She should know what is happening and what it might mean for the next few days. And our formal statement to the Arbiter? Lena said. She had appeared in the doorway behind Owen, holding her tablet. I will write it myself this morning, I said. It is short. It just needs to say one thing clearly. What is that? That we are not leaving the conclave, I said. We are creating the conditions for the conclave to actually work. I sat down and began to write. The statement I sent to the Arbiter was 1 page. It said that the human mission had withdrawn from the formal session due to procedural concerns about the framework's treatment of human-administered infrastructure. It said that the mission remained committed to a resolution and was available to participate in any discussion designed to address those concerns. It said that the mission welcomed the opportunity to contribute to a framework that genuinely reflected the interests of all represented parties. It was careful, measured, and unambiguous. It was also the first thing the Arbiter had received from the human table that was longer than 3 sentences. The Arbiter's response came within the hour. Formal, procedurally precise, exactly what it needed to be. The conclave noted the mission statement. The conclave remained in session. The Arbiter's office stood ready to facilitate any discussions the mission believed would be productive. What it did not say, but what I read clearly in its careful neutrality, was, "We did not expect you to do this, and we are still figuring out what it means." I filed that away. The communication device on my desk chimed twice more in the 2 hours after the Arbiter's response. The first was from Delegate Vell. It was 2 sentences. She had reviewed our commitment regarding vein shipping routes and found it more substantive than expected. She was forwarding it to her mission's legal team for documentation review. Legal review. She was treating it as a real document, which it was, because I had sent it through the proper infrastructure accords channel, rather than as a diplomatic courtesy communication. She was taking it seriously, which meant she was taking us seriously, which was the thing that mattered. The second message was from a number I did not immediately recognize. I ran it through our identification system while I was reading it. It was a personal channel, registered to a private address on the Solveth Communion's administrative network, not Mirren's official line, not the mission's formal contact, a personal address. The message said, "The Solveth Communion's position is not identical to the Krithali position. We recognize there is a distinction between the two. Some members of our delegation believe the current framework's approach to the Callaway question is an oversimplification. I am not in a position to say more at this time." It was unsigned. I read it 3 times. Then I showed it to Owen. He read it. He looked up at me. "A Solveth person who disagrees with Mirren." "A Solveth person," I said, "who is telling us, without signing their name, that the coalition's internal position is not as uniform as it appears. Which means Mirren does not have full control of her delegation's opinion on the Callaway section. Which means the framework Mirren brought to our quarters 3 days ago may not have had unanimous backing from within the Solveth mission itself." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That changes the pressure map considerably." "It does," I said. "It means that if Orath pushes Mirren hard on revision, she may not be fighting it as strongly as she would if her delegation were fully aligned." "And if Orath knows this?" "Orath almost certainly knows this," I said. "He has been working with the Solveth for months. He knows where their pressure points are. The question is whether he will use that knowledge to push for a revision that serves the coalition's durability, or whether he will try to hold the original framework together because revision looks like weakness." I thought for a moment. "He will revise," I said. "He is not a person who mistakes the appearance of strength for actual strength. I have watched him for 9 days. He knows the difference." Sam came in from the communication room. "The Krithali mission has submitted a formal request to the Arbiter's office. They are asking for a private facilitated session with all co-interested parties to discuss the framework's infrastructure provisions." I looked at him. "All co-interested parties," I said. "That is the phrase used. The Arbiter's office has forwarded the request to our mission." "Which means they are asking us to come back to the table," Lena said. She was at the window, and she turned now with the expression of someone who has been running numbers and found them satisfying. "Not through the formal session, through a private facilitated session that they requested." "Yes," I said. "They asked," she said. "Not us. They asked." "Yes." She turned back to the window. "Good," she said quietly. It was the most I had heard her say in a single word in 3 days. I drafted a response to the Arbiter's forwarded request. It said that the human mission was prepared to participate in a private facilitated session and would be available at the arbiter's convenience. It said we looked forward to a productive discussion. Then I did something I do not do often, which is call my mother. She is 71 and lives in Cork, and she has been following my career since I was appointed to the Xenopolitical Division 12 years ago, with the specific mixture of pride and concern that Irish mothers have perfected over centuries of sending people into complicated situations. She knows more about alien politics than most people give her credit for, because she reads everything I send her. The call connected after a moment. She looked at her screen and said, "Nora, it is past midnight here. I know, I am sorry." You walked out of the thing, not a question. She had seen the news relay. I did. She was quiet for a moment. Then, good. I laughed. Actually laughed, which I had not done in 9 days. "How do you know it was good?" I asked. "Because you would not have done it if it was not," she said simply. "Now stop calling your mother at midnight, and go to sleep. You have things to do tomorrow." She was right. I always sleep better after talking to her, which is a thing I have never fully understood, and have decided not to question. I went to sleep. In the morning, the message I had been waiting for arrived. It was from Orath, personal channel, not his aide, him directly, which was the second time he had communicated with me that way, the first being in the private meeting where he brought the formal offer. The message said, "Ambassador Callan, I understand we will be speaking in the facilitated session. I also understand that certain elements of the current framework require genuine discussion rather than procedural management. I look forward to an honest conversation. First voice Orath." I read it twice. Then I looked at Owen. "He said honest," Owen noted. "He said honest," I confirmed. "The same word Elder Dresch used." "Yes." Owen looked at me carefully. "Is that a coincidence?" "The Dravik and the Krithali do not share language in the way that would produce accidental word choices," I said. "If both of them used the same word in messages to us, on the same morning, after a night where both of them were presumably discussing their positions, they talked to each other," Owen said. "Or at minimum, the Dravik's intentions reached Orath through whatever channel exists between them, and Orath chose to respond with the same register. Either way, it means the private session is going to be different from everything that has happened in the formal chamber." I looked at the photograph of Calloway. "Get me Captain Rhea one more time before we go," I said. "The relay check-in window is in 4 hours. I want her to know we will be in a private session when it processes, and that she should send me confirmation the moment it completes." "And if it does not complete normally?" Owen asked. "It will complete normally," I said, "because the Krithali need it to, and because they now know that we know that they need it to. Which means the relay check-in, this morning, is not just a navigation protocol. It is a signal from them to us, that they are not going to try to solve this problem by pressure." Owen thought about that. "They are coming to the table as equals. They are coming to the table as the larger power that needs something from the smaller one," I said. "Which in any honest calculation of this situation, is exactly what they are." I put on my jacket. "Now," I said, "let us go have an honest conversation." The private facilitated session took place in a working room on the 4th floor of the Conclave Facilities Administrative Wing. Not in the Grand Chamber, not in any of the formal delegation suites. A working room, 6 meters by 8. A long table, chairs, atmospheric controls set for multi-species comfort, a single translation relay mounted in the ceiling. The arbiter had chosen it specifically, I suspected, to remove every possible layer of ceremonial positioning from what was about to happen. No podiums, no tiered seating, no historical architecture communicating the weight of millennia. Just a table. Orath arrived with one aide. Mirren arrived with one aide. Elder Dresch arrived alone, which was either a statement of confidence or a statement about how the Dravik approach a room where they intend to be heard, rather than represented. Delegate Vel arrived with the Kurathi ambassador, Po Rin Sar, which I had not anticipated and which pleased me considerably. They had come together, without being invited together, which meant they had decided on their own that their interests were aligned enough to enter this room as a unit. I arrived with Owen and Lena. Sam stayed at our mission quarters to manage incoming communications. because I had a feeling the next few hours were going to produce more messages than one person could track. The arbiter opened the session with 3 sentences. This was a facilitated discussion, not a formal session. Statements made here were off the official record, unless all parties agreed to enter them. The goal was honest conversation, rather than procedural performance. Then the arbiter said, "I would suggest we begin with what everyone actually needs," and sat down. Orath looked across the table at me. I looked back at him. He said, "I owe you something before we begin. At the start of this conclave, the Krathali bloc interrupted your delegation 17 times in formal session. 11 of those were from my bloc directly. That was not appropriate treatment of a full-status delegation." The room was quiet, not awkward quiet, the quiet of people paying attention. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I do not say it to clear a debt," he said. "I say it because the approach was wrong, and the approach led us here, to a situation that a different approach would not have produced. That is a practical observation, not a moral one, although it may be both." Elder Dresch said nothing, but his eyes moved slightly, in the way I had begun to recognize as Dravik agreement. Mirren said, "The Solvith position on the framework was developed in coordination with the Krathali. We believed it addressed the core interests of all relevant parties. We were incorrect about what those parties were." She said it without apology but also without defensiveness, which was its own kind of honesty. Delegate Vell said, very quietly, "You were not incorrect about which parties you considered relevant. You were incorrect about which parties are relevant." Orath looked at her, not with irritation, with something that looked like genuine acknowledgement. Po Rin Sar, the Karathi ambassador, had not spoken yet. He had been listening with the concentrated stillness of someone who is prepared for a room that usually talks over him and is recalibrating in real time. When he spoke, it was in a level voice that carried no performance in it. "The Karathi flag 640 registered vessels," he said. "All of them transit the corridor at least twice per standard year. The current framework's shipping protection language, as written, cannot be enforced by our mission, and is not designed to be. That is the entirety of our position." No one spoke for a moment. Then Orath said, "How many of those vessels use Station Callaway?" Poe looked at him. 411. Orath turned to me. "Ambassador Callan." "Yes." "The framework's treatment of Station Callaway was, as you said in your withdrawal statement, a settled premise, rather than a negotiated position." "Yes," I said, "it was." "I would like to understand," he said, "what you are prepared to agree to regarding Callaway. If the Council agrees to treat the question as a genuine negotiation, rather than a managed transition." And there it was. The sentence that the entire 9 days of formal sessions and interrupted statements and private approaches and teacups and morning messages had been building toward. Not, "Here is what we are offering you." Not, "Here is what you must accept." "What are you prepared to agree to?" I had been ready for this question for several days, but I took a moment before answering, because the moment was worth taking. "We are prepared to agree to the following," I said. "Station Callaway remains under human administrative authority. A council liaison is embedded in the station's reporting structure, with full access to operational data and the right to report formally to the Corridor Oversight Commission, but without veto authority over operational decisions. Callaway guarantees open access to all treaty parties on equal terms, with no preferential pricing or service tiering based on species or diplomatic status. We provide quarterly reports to the Commission on facility use, safety, and capacity, and we are prepared to commit, in writing and registered under the infrastructure accords, to minimum service level agreements for Vane and Karathi flagged vessels specifically, because those two parties have been carrying the longest running risk in this region, with the least protection." Poe looked at me. Vell looked at me. Elder Dresch's eyes moved again. "In exchange," I continued, "we want full co-signatory status on the Corridor Treaty. Not Observer Plus. Not Protected Partnership. Not a designation that sounds significant, but contains a quiet provision for review by coalition vote. Equal standing. A vote on the Corridor Oversight Commission, and our administrative authority over Callaway structurally guaranteed in the treaty language, not dependent on ongoing goodwill." Mirren said, immediately, "Co-signatory status for a species 11 years into interstellar engagement is unprecedented." 12 years. I said. And yes, it is. So is building the only functional infrastructure in 17 light-years of contested space at year 9. Orath looked at Mirren. Mirren looked at Orath. The thing about a room with 6 parties rather than 62 is that the looks mean more, because there is nowhere to hide them. The Solvith's concern, Mirren said, after a moment, is that co-signatory status sets a precedent that other new species will invoke. The precedent, I said carefully, is that species which build critical infrastructure, in contested regions, are treated as parties to the agreements governing those regions. That precedent exists, regardless of whether we are named co-signatories. The question is whether the treaty reflects reality. Orath made a sound that his translation device rendered as a neutral acknowledgement, but which I had learned was Krathali for. That is a point I cannot argue with, and am considering how to proceed without conceding it immediately. Elder Dresh spoke for the first time since the opening exchanges. The Dravik would formally support co-signatory status for the human mission under a treaty that addresses Northern Corridor access, with explicit rather than contingent language. Orath looked at him. Dresh looked back. We have been contingent long enough, he said simply. Mirren said, the Solveth can accept a review mechanism, 20-year intervals, independent assessment body, criteria established in the treaty itself. I had been ready for this too. We can accept that structure if the criteria are objective, and the assessment is genuinely independent, not a coalition vote, not a body appointed by the current signatories, an independent technical panel selected jointly, with Callaway excluded from the vote on our own assessment. Mirren thought for a moment. 20-year intervals, jointly selected panel, human mission excluded from voting on their own review, criteria in the treaty. Yes, I said, that is what we would need. Orath said, the Vane and Karathi shipping protections. Poe looked at him with a slight shift in expression that was the Karathi equivalent of attention sharpening. The language needs to be binding, Orath said. Named routes, annual compliance review, a reporting mechanism that has teeth. He looked at me, then at Poe, then back at me. I spoke with your ambassadors last night. I understand what was missing from the current draft. I am prepared to recommend to my delegation that the shipping protection language be rewritten to include those elements. Poe was very still. Vel said, very quietly, First voice Orath. In 60 years of attending these sessions, I have not heard a Krathali senior delegate offer to strengthen language, protecting Vane and Karathi interests without being asked. Orath looked at her. I was asked, he said. The request was implicit, but it was present. It was in the gap between what the human mission's position document said and what the current framework contained. He glanced at me. I read your position document, all of it. I know, I said. I read it 3 times. That produced something in the room that was not quite a smile, but was its near neighbor. We worked for 4 hours. It was the most productive 4 hours I had experienced since before the conclave started. Not because everyone agreed. We did not agree on everything. The initial framework for the co-signatory review mechanism went through 6 iterations before Mirren was satisfied with the independent structure of the assessment panel. The Dravik Northern Access language required 3 rewrites to achieve the balance between explicit and durable that Dresh needed, without triggering the Solveth's concern about precedent setting for future extraction operations. The Van and Karathi shipping provisions took 40 minutes just to establish the right scope of the named routes section. But we were working, all of us, around a table, on a document that was going to reflect what everyone in the room actually needed. It was what a negotiation is supposed to be. In the early afternoon, when we had reached a point where the structure was clear and the remaining work was detail rather than substance, Orath sat back in his seat and looked at me across the table with an expression that I had not seen from him before. Not the performance of the formal session, not the careful calibration of the private approach in our quarters. Something more direct. Your mission was assigned the seat nearest to the door, he said. In the grand chamber. Yes, I said. That is a tradition, he said. It has been done that way for as long as the conclave has functioned. I know, I said. Your usher explained it to me on day 1. He was quiet for a moment. You requested that position. I looked at him. Before we assigned it, he said, I had my administrative staff review the pre-conclave seating request. Your mission submitted a preference for end-of-arc positioning, adjacent to the secondary exit, 3 weeks before you arrived. The room was very quiet. Lena, behind me, had gone completely still in the way she did when something had just become clear that had not been clear before. Owen's expression did not change. He had known. Of course he had known. He had handled the pre-conclave logistics. Elder Dresch made the small sound that his translation device did not render. This time it was definitely not neutral. Why? Orath said. I thought about how to answer that. Optionality, I said finally. I wanted to know where the exits were. In any room I walk into, I want to know where the exits are. It is a habit. He looked at me for a long moment. And if we had assigned you a different seat, he said, would you have still? I would have found the door, I said. In any room I am in, I find the door. It is not specific to this chamber. It is specific to how I approach any situation where the balance of power is not in my favor. And the seat request, he said slowly, meant that when we placed you near the door, you already knew you had chosen that position, rather than been assigned to it. Yes, I said, which is a small thing, but small things matter. Mirren said, because it meant you were never in the position we thought you were in. I was in the position you thought I was in, I said. The seat was the same. The door was the same. The difference was in my relationship to the position. Orath was looking at me with an expression I could not fully classify. It was not admiration, exactly. Not resentment. Something more complicated and more honest than either. Humanity has been doing this longer than 43 years, he said. We have been doing this exact thing since before we had space travel, I said. The specifics change. The principle does not. What principle? I thought about how to say it in a way that would translate accurately. When you are not the most powerful entity in the room, I said, you learn the room, and then you change it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, when the treaty is finalized, I would recommend that the seating in the Grand Chamber be reorganized. Delegations should be placed by the nature of their involvement in the treaty, not by the length of their membership in the Council.
I would support that recommendation,
Elder Dresch said. Mirren said,
as would the Solveth Communion.
Delegate Vel said nothing, but she put her hands flat on the table in front of her, in the gesture I had learned to read as something mattering deeply. Po Rinsar said, the Kurathi have been in the upper tier for 60 years. Not after this treaty, Orath said. The room was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that happens when something has just been decided, that was not on the formal agenda, but that everyone recognizes as necessary. I looked at Owen. He gave me the smallest possible nod, which meant, we are in a different place than we were this morning. We were in a place where a room full of ancient civilizations had acknowledged, not in the formal session record, not in the treaty language, but in the flat working light of a functional meeting room, that the balance of the conversation had shifted. Not because we were stronger, because we had been paying attention. I looked at the working document on the table. The framework that was emerging from it was not the one that Orath and Mirren had submitted to the formal session that morning. It was not the one I had written in my notes 2 nights ago. It was the one that happened when everyone in the room stopped protecting their positions long enough to map their actual needs. It was, in fact, considerably better than what anyone had arrived at the conclave expecting to achieve. Including us. I made a note of that, because it is the thing about genuine negotiation that theory often fails to capture. When you stop trying to win and start trying to solve, the solution is almost always better than the victory would have been. The session concluded in the late afternoon. We had a working framework, not a final document, but a structure that everyone at the table had contributed to, and that no one at the table had a fundamental objection to. The arbiter, who had said almost nothing during the 4 working hours, spoke at the close with the precise economy of someone who has seen a great many negotiations and knows the moment when one has reached its productive limit for the day. The parties will review the working framework overnight, the arbiter said. A follow-up session is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The arbiter's office will circulate the working document to all conclave delegations this evening for information, marked as a facilitated working document, not a formal submission. Everyone agreed. Everyone gathered their materials. The room began to disperse with the purposeful energy of people who have real work to do and a clear direction to do it in. Orath paused on his way to the door. "Ambassador Callan," he said. I stopped. He looked at me for a moment. Not with the formal bearing of the Grand Chamber, not with the calculated presentation of the private approach, with something more direct, from a person rather than a title. "Your species is going to be very difficult," he said, "for a very long time. We will try to make it worth it," I said. He gave me the Krathali approximation of a nod, which involves a specific tilt of the primary shoulders, and walked out. Dresh paused as well. He did not speak. He simply looked at me with those dark, still eyes for a moment, and made the small sound that his device did not render. I looked back at him. Then he left. Owen appeared at my side. "Captain Rhea sent confirmation 20 minutes ago. The Krathali relay check-in processed normally. All fleet elements confirmed." "Good," I said. "She also says the Dravik research vessel filed a departure plan this morning. They are scheduled to leave tomorrow." "After the follow-up session," I noted. "Yes," Owen said. "Almost exactly after." I looked at the working framework document still spread across the table. 6 parties' handwriting, in 6 different systems, layered over the base text. It looked like what it was, something built rather than imposed. "Let us go write the response to the Arbiter's circulation notice," I said. "And then I want to review the overnight document with fresh eyes in the morning before the session." We walked out of the working room and back toward our quarters through the long administrative corridor. Behind us, the room was already being reset for the next day's session. The door to it was standing open. I did not look back at it. I did not need to. The corridor treaty was signed on the 19th day of the consultation period, 11 days ahead of the 30-day window the Arbiter had formally opened. It was not a fast signature. Nothing about the working sessions that produced it had been fast. There were 5 more full days of negotiation after the initial private facilitated session, 3 more rewrites of the Northern Corridor access provisions, 2 late-evening conversations between Orath and Dresh that I knew about, because both of them told me afterward that the conversations had happened, 2 attempts by the Solveth legal team to insert qualification language into the independent assessment panel structure that we quietly but firmly pushed back on, and 1 moment on day 14 when the Vane and Karathi shipping route language nearly collapsed over a disagreement about which transit routes would be specifically named. That last problem I solved by getting Delegate Vel and Delegate Poe in a room with our navigation team's route data from Callaway and asking them to look at the actual traffic patterns rather than the historical claim maps, which showed that the routes they most needed protected were slightly different from the routes they had been defending on principle. It took 40 minutes. It produced better language. That is what happens when you let the people who know the operational reality write the operational language. The final treaty document was 63 pages, including appendices on the corridor's administrative structure, the Joint Oversight Commission's composition and procedures, the Callaway co-administration arrangement, the Northern Extraction Access Framework, and the shipping protection provisions, which had grown from 2 inadequate paragraphs to 6 dense, carefully binding pages. Every party at the working table had contributed language to the final document. Every party at the working table had also been persuaded, at some point in the process, to give up a position they had held, because the position was a defense of something they did not actually need, as much as they needed something else. That is what real negotiation produces, not winners and losers, a document that solves the actual problem rather than reflecting the power balance at the start of the conversation. On the morning of the signing, I sat in our mission quarters and looked at the photograph of Callaway on the wall for a longer time than I usually spent looking at anything. It was the same photograph I had put on the wall on day 1, 3 arms catching starlight, 47 humans on an installation in the middle of 17 light-years of disputed space, doing their jobs with the specific competence of people who know that what they are doing matters, without needing to be reminded of it. Captain Rhea had sent me a message that morning. She had been informed about the treaty contents 2 days before the signing, as part of the advance notification to current Callaway operators. Her message was 4 words. "You said we would." I had sent back 2. We did. The signing ceremony was held in the Grand Chamber. All 62 delegations present. Full formal dress. The Arbiter presided, with the particular gravity that the Velhari bring to formal occasions, which is the gravity of people who have been watching the galaxy have formal occasions for longer than most species can calculate. The human delegation's seating position for the ceremony had been the subject of a brief separate discussion. Under Orath's proposal, accepted by the full conclave without significant objection, the treaty signatories were seated by their involvement in the treaty's construction, rather than by their tenure in the council. The human diplomatic missions table was in the center of the main arc, not near the door. I noticed that Owen and Lena and Sam all noticed it at the same moment I did, because we all paused at the same point in walking down the center aisle. And then we kept walking, because pausing is fine but stopping is unnecessary. I sat down. The table was different from the one at the end of the arc, slightly larger. The chairs had better padding, which was either a coincidence or a statement about how long conclave proceedings can run. I chose to believe it was a statement. The signing order had also changed. Under the new arrangement, first to sign were the parties who had built the infrastructure that made the treaty necessary. Second were the parties with the longest territorial stakes. Third were the parties with the deepest operational dependencies. The sequence reflected the actual structure of what had been negotiated, rather than who had been at the council table the longest. The arbiter announced the order. The human diplomatic mission was called first. I walked to the center table. The signing instrument was a physical stylus, because the Galactic Archive requires original physical signatures on all founding documents, which is a tradition I find unexpectedly moving, the record of an agreement made between species who might not have met otherwise, preserved in the medium of a hand holding an instrument and making a mark. I signed my name. Ambassador Nora Callan, Human Diplomatic Mission to the Helix Corridor Conclave. The stylus made a sound on the document surface that was barely audible in the large room. I heard it anyway. Then I walked back to our table, and Owen handed me the water I had asked him to have ready, because signing documents in front of 62 alien delegations produces a specific kind of dryness in the throat that I had not anticipated. The rest of the signing took 42 minutes. Each delegation in order, each name added to the document, the record accumulating with the specific weight of things that are going to matter for a very long time. When Delegate Vell signed, on behalf of the Vane Shipping Authority, she paused for a moment after making her mark and looked up, not at the chamber generally, at the human table. I looked back at her. She gave me the slow nod that I had first seen at the refreshment station on day one of the conclave, the nod that was either agreement or gratitude or both. I gave her one in return. When Delegate Poe signed, on behalf of the Kirathi Trade Union, he did not look anywhere in particular. He looked at the document and signed and sat down with the bearing of someone who has completed something that took longer than it should have, and who is at peace with that because it is done. When Elder Dresch signed, on behalf of the Dravik Collective, he made the mark with the unhurried precision of someone for whom every action is completed fully before the next one is considered. Then he looked up at the human table. I looked at him. He made the small sound that his translation device never rendered. Then he inclined his head, very slightly, in a gesture that I was fairly certain was not a standard Dravik diplomatic acknowledgement, but something more personal. When Orath signed, last of the primary parties, the chamber was very quiet. He stood at the signing table for a moment, after completing his mark, looking at the document, not reading it. He had read it many times, looking at it in the way you look at something that represents a significant amount of work and a significant change from where you expected to end up. Then he returned to the Krathali table. The arbiter formally declared the Helix Corridor Treaty in effect. The chamber produced sound, not applause in the human sense, the various species-specific acknowledgments of significant moments, layered over each other in the specific way that 62 different traditions produce when they overlap. It was the loudest the room had been since the conclave opened. I sat through it, and felt the strange double quality that significant moments have, the part of you that is present in the moment, and the part of you that is already watching yourself be present, knowing that this is one of those things you will need to describe later. The reception afterward was the longest social event of the entire conclave. 4 hours. Every delegation in attendance. The formal diplomatic photography and the exchange of commemorative documents, and the careful conversations that happen when everyone knows that the hard work is done and the next phase has not yet started. 3 conversations from that reception are the ones I remember most clearly. The first was with Mirren. She found me near the end of the first hour, when the ceremony's energy was settling into the normal rhythm of a gathering, where people are genuinely glad to be where they are. Ambassador Callan, she said. Excellency Mirren, I said. She was quiet for a moment, which for Mirren was itself a signal. She was not a person who used silence as a pause. She used it as a choice. The Solveth have reviewed the internal correspondence relating to our approach to this conclave, she said. There is an unsigned message in our records, sent to your mission from a Solveth private channel, indicating that some members of our delegation had concerns about the original framework's treatment of the Callaway question. I looked at her. I am not asking you to confirm anything about that message, she said. I am informing you that we are aware it was sent. I appreciate you telling me, I said. The person who sent it was expressing a genuine view, she said. The view was not wrong. The original approach was inadequate, and the outcome we have reached is better for the Solveth communion, as well as for everyone else. She paused. I want you to know that the member of our delegation who sent that message has not been penalized for doing so. I looked at her for a moment. I am glad to hear that. We do not, she said, discourage honest internal dissent. That is not how we arrived at 3 centuries of navigating this council without a significant breakdown. The message should have come to me directly, rather than through an unofficial channel, but the content was not inappropriate. The content suggested to us that there was room for a different conversation than the one the formal session was producing, I said. Yes, she said. That was its effect. She looked at me steadily. You read it that way. I try to read things as they are. She made a small sound that her translation device rendered as something between acknowledgement and approval. You will find, she said, that the Solveth communion prefers to work with partners who read things as they are. We are less comfortable with partners who read things as they are wish them to be. I have found that most complex situations are more solvable when everyone reads them accurately, I said. Yes, she said. That is also our experience. She looked at the room briefly. The Solveth will be paying close attention to the human mission going forward, Ambassador Callan. Not with the attention we were paying before. A different kind. I look forward to working with you under that attention, I said. She gave me the precise Solveth acknowledgement that their files described as a formal courteous close, and moved on. The second conversation was with Orath. He came to me late in the reception, when the room had thinned to perhaps 1/3 of its initial population, and the formal photography was long since finished. He was without his aides, which he had not been at any point during the conclave proper. First voice Orath, I said. Ambassador Callan. He looked at the room for a moment. I want to tell you something that is not for the record. All right? When we assigned you the seat near the door on day 1, he said, I approved the seating arrangement without looking at it carefully. It was the standard placement for the newest delegation. I did not think about what it communicated. You mentioned that in the working session, I said. I mentioned that the interruptions were wrong, he said. I am saying now that the seating was wrong. Not because you had requested it first, because the principle is wrong. A delegation invited to a full status position in the conclave should not be placed symbolically at the edge of the room. That is a contradiction between what the designation means and how it is treated. I looked at him. Will you change the tradition? I have already submitted a procedural recommendation to the Arbiter's office, he said. The seating arrangement for future conclaves should reflect the subject of the session, rather than the historical precedents of the delegations. He paused. It will not pass without opposition. Several of the elder delegations are very attached to the traditional arrangement. Change usually meets opposition, I said. Yes, he said. That is something humans and Krithali appear to have in common. Something in his voice carried the weight of the specific kind of admission that senior people make when they have revised a view they held for a long time. First voice Orath, I said. If I can ask you something directly. Please. When you saw me walk out of the session on day 9, in that first moment, what did you think? He was quiet for a short time. My first thought, he said, was that the walkout was premature, that you had misread the situation and were making a decision that would damage your mission's position. And your second thought? My second thought, he said, was that you had been interrupted 17 times and were still maintaining professional discipline, and that a species capable of that discipline does not make a decision like that by accident. And the 7 seconds? He looked at me. I was counting, he said. to see how long the room would wait before someone spoke, to measure what we were actually dealing with. What did the 7 seconds tell you? That the room was afraid to get it wrong, he said, and that fear, in that context, meant the room recognized that you had more leverage than it had planned for. I thought about that. You counted too, he said. Not a question. I always count, I said. He made the Krathali shoulder acknowledgement that I had spent 9 days learning to read as meaning something genuine. Your species, he said, will be very complicated to negotiate with. We have been practicing for a long time, I said. On each other, he said. I know. I have read some of your history. You have been negotiating under power imbalance since before you had a word for it. It turns out, I said, that is good preparation. He looked at me for one more moment with the expression I had never fully classified, but which I understood now as something between respect and the satisfaction of a person who has encountered something genuinely new. Then he said, "It was a pleasure, Ambassador Callan. I expect it will be a complicated pleasure going forward." "I expect the same," I said. First voice Orath. He left. The third conversation was the shortest. Elder Dresh found me near the exit, as the reception was concluding, as people were gathering their things and making the formal courteous farewells that close an event like this. He stopped beside me and looked at me for a moment. "You sent a 3-word message," he said. "Yes." "We see you," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. "The Dravik," he said, "have been attending conclaves for 240 years. In that time, no delegation from any species in this council has ever sent us a 3-word message that said only that." I looked at him. I meant it. "I know," he said. "That was the part that mattered." He made the small sound one final time, and then he left, and I stood near the exit of the reception hall as the last groups of delegates trickled out, and I thought about 240 years of attending conclaves without anyone sending you 3 words to say they had noticed you were there. Owen appeared at my shoulder. "Rhea wants to know if we are coming to Callaway," he said. "She says the station would benefit from a visit from the ambassador. Tell her we will come in the next 30 days, I said. "I want to be there for the first formal reporting meeting with the council liaison. She will be pleased." He paused. Delegate Vel also sent a message. She and Po Rin Sar are requesting a follow-up conversation about the implementation schedule for the shipping route protections. "Schedule it," I said, "early, before the implementation working group starts. I want them in the first conversation, not the last." "Done." He paused again. "And your mother called." I looked at him. "She heard the signing was completed," he said. "She said, and I am quoting, 'Tell Nora I am very proud, and also that she should eat something and sleep.'" I laughed. "Tell her I will," I said. We walked out of the reception hall into the last light of the Veth Prime evening. The city stretched out in every direction, ancient and illuminated, having outlasted every disagreement that had ever been argued in its buildings. The treaty was signed. The work of implementing it had not yet begun, which meant the work of implementing it was about to begin, which is the thing about agreements. They are the beginning, not the end. I looked up at the sky, which was pale green at this hour, filtering the light of the sun in the way that alien atmospheres do, familiar enough now to feel almost ordinary. The door of the reception hall was still open behind us. Through it, I could hear the last sounds of the conclave's gathering, voices in multiple languages, the hum of translation devices, the particular acoustic of a very large room beginning to empty. I did not look back at it. We walked toward our quarters, through the streets of a city that had been old before humanity existed, and I thought about what came next. What came next was the work. That has always been my favorite part. They asked me to write the field report. I wrote it. 412 pages, fully documented, with appendices on leverage analysis, multilateral negotiation frameworks, the role of infrastructure positioning in interstellar diplomatic strategy, and a section I titled Operational Observations on Long-Form Patience as Diplomatic Method, that my superior at the Diplomatic Corps, Director Alan Hadley, told me was going to be required reading for every cohort starting with the next one. Then the Corps asked me to write this, the personal account, the one that goes in the training archive rather than the formal record, the one that future ambassadors will read before their first major assignment, in the way I had read accounts like it before mine. I have been trying for 3 months to figure out what the most useful thing to say is. Here is what I keep coming back to. We were a young species in a very old room. The species around us had been navigating the politics of the stars since before humanity had figured out how to cross its own oceans. They had protocols for everything, for greeting and for dismissing, for taking and for yielding, for winning and for losing. They had seen every kind of situation that an interstellar political body can produce over enough centuries of existence. They had one significant gap. They had never had to deal with a species that had spent its entire pre-contact history being the underdog. Not just historically, structurally, biologically, politically, humanity has been producing people who were not the most powerful entity in the room, and teaching them to matter anyway, for as long as we have had recorded history. We have entire narrative traditions built around it. Our literature, our philosophy, our political theory, our religious traditions, our folk stories, our songs. An enormous fraction of human cultural output is about what you do when the balance of power is not in your favor. We study it, we celebrate it, we teach it to our children. We write about it, argue about it, revisit it in different contexts, refine our understanding of it across generations. When First Voice Orath interrupted me 11 times in 9 days, he was doing something he had probably done to every new delegation he had ever encountered. It was routine. It signaled a hierarchy that the room understood and accepted. He did not realize he was also giving me data. Every interruption told me something about his assumptions. Every time Excellency Mirren set down a cup without drinking from it, she was communicating something about her calculations. Every glance between Delegate Vell and Delegate Poe in the upper tiers was a data point about who in that room was afraid and what they were afraid of. Every time Elder Dresch said nothing, I was learning the shape of what he was waiting for. I had 11 years of xenopolitical study behind me, and 3 years of Callaway being built behind that, and a long tradition of humans learning to read rooms they were not expected to matter in, stretching back further than any current member of the Galactic Council has been keeping records. We were ready for that room in a way the room was not ready for us. That is not a statement of superiority. The Krethali have been navigating interstellar politics for longer than our written language has existed. The Dravik have developed a form of institutional patience that I spent the entire conclave studying and still do not fully understand. The Solvith Communion has maintained 3 centuries of consistent diplomatic positioning in a council where the political landscape shifts every generation. These are real capabilities, built over real time, and we do not have them. But this moment, this specific moment, belonged to us. Because this specific moment required exactly the combination of things we had: a well-placed facility, patience that did not look like patience, attention that did not advertise itself, the willingness to walk through a door at the right moment, and somewhere worth walking to. The most common question I get when I speak about this to incoming diplomatic cohorts is, when did you know? When did you know you were going to walk out? The answer is, I knew when I understood that walking out was the only way to walk back in, as something real. The door near the exit, the seat at the end of the arc, the 9 days of being managed rather than engaged. All of it pointed toward the same necessary moment, the moment when the room had to decide what it would cost to proceed without us. We made sure the cost was real. And we made sure the door we walked out of led somewhere worth going. Now, 3 months after the signing, I want to try to say something about what actually happened in that room that is harder to articulate than the strategy. The strategy is clean. In the field report, it takes about 40 pages to explain precisely, with the supporting documentation and the timeline and the analysis of each party's position. Future ambassadors can read it, study it, adapt it to different contexts. The strategy is teachable. What is harder to teach is the feeling of day 9, minute 3, when I picked up my briefing case in the middle of a formal session with 62 alien delegations watching me and started walking toward a door I had been watching for 9 days. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was angry or frustrated or tired of being interrupted or tired of the seat near the door. Because I had spent 9 days making sure that the moment I walked out of that room, the room would have to recalibrate. And I knew, in that moment, that the recalibration was ready to happen. The conditions were right. The leverage was real. The Dravik vessel at Callaway was in place. The relay check-in was 31 hours out. Vel and Poe had been in our meeting the night before. Elder Dresch had received 3 words and understood what they meant. It was time. That feeling, of recognizing that a moment has arrived for which you have been preparing without being certain it would ever arrive, is not something I can put in a training document. It is the product of paying attention for long enough that the pattern becomes clear. I want to say something about patience, because I think it is the thing that people most often get wrong about what happened in the corridor conclave. Patience is not waiting. Waiting is passive. Waiting is what you do when you have no choice but to let time pass. Patience is active. Patience is continuing to pay attention, continuing to build, continuing to make small, careful moves while the larger situation develops, without forcing the larger situation to develop on your timeline, rather than its own. I was not patient in the conclave because I was calm, or because I had no feelings about being interrupted 17 times. I was interrupted 17 times, and I counted every single one, and it took genuine effort to maintain the professional demeanor that the situation required. I was patient because I understood that the moment for the large move had not yet arrived, and forcing it before it arrived would waste everything the preparation had built. There is a phrase that I learned from my grandmother when I was very young, before I knew what it meant. The river does not fight the rock, it simply goes around, and eventually the rock is somewhere else. My grandmother used it to describe interpersonal patience, the kind of patience you need when someone in your life is being unreasonable, and you have to decide how to respond. But I thought about it on day 9, walking toward the door, because it is also the truest description I have found of what we did in the conclave. We did not fight the room. We did not push back against the interruptions or the seating, or the managed position in the framework. We went around it, carefully and slowly, building the conditions under which the room would have to come to us. And eventually the rock was somewhere else. I want to say something about Station Callaway, because Callaway is the part of this story that people most often focus on, and also the part that is most often misunderstood. Callaway is a refueling depot, 47 people, 3 operational arms, docking facilities for 48 vessels simultaneously, a communications relay array, atmospheric maintenance equipment, a small medical facility, and a cafeteria that Captain Ria once described to me as functional but ambitious. It is not a military installation. It has no weapons systems. It was built by a construction team using publicly available technology and conventional engineering. The geometry that put it at the center of the corridor's only navigable channel was not a secret plan. It was a calculation based on where the fuel demand would be greatest, which was the center. What made Callaway significant was not that we built it there, it was that we built it first. That is the thing about infrastructure. Whoever builds it first shapes the geography of what comes after. The Galactic Council had been arguing about the Helix corridor for decades, before humanity was in contact with any species in this room. During those decades, the corridor's center point was unoccupied, because every species with the means to build there was too busy protecting its position to risk the resources on infrastructure that would require ongoing coordination with competitors. We built there because we are new. We did not have decades of entrenched positions to protect. We had an analysis of where the corridor was going to matter operationally, and the ability to commit to it without the accumulated caution of 1,000 years of interstellar politics slowing us down. Being new is usually a disadvantage. At Callaway, it was the advantage. I want to say something about the door. Not the specific door of the Grand Chamber on Veth Prime, the principle of the door. In any room where the balance of power is not in your favor, the door is the most important thing to know about. Not because you are planning to leave, because knowing where the door is, and being able to go through it if necessary, is the only way to be genuinely present in the room, rather than trapped in it. A party that cannot leave is not a participant. It is a subject of the negotiation, rather than a party to it. This applies to rooms that are not literally rooms. It applies to jobs, and to relationships, and to institutions, and to situations of every kind. The moment you are unable to walk away from something is the moment your position in it is determined by other people's calculations rather than your own. We could not have walked out of the conclave on day 9 if we had not built somewhere to walk to. If Callaway had not existed, or if Calloway had not been operationally significant, the walkout would have been a gesture that damaged only us. The door was only real because somewhere worth walking to existed. That is the lesson that I believe generalizes beyond the specific circumstances of the conclave. Before you walk into any room where the balance of power is not in your favor, build something real that you can walk toward if you need to leave. Not a threat, not a bluff. Something actual, that serves a real function, that would genuinely be missed if it were unavailable. Then walk into the room, find the door, and pay attention. I want to say something about the people on the other side of the table, because this story is most often told as a story about what humanity did, and that framing is incomplete. Orath revised his position. That required him to acknowledge that the approach his delegation had taken for 9 days was wrong, which is a thing that senior figures with significant authority rarely do easily. He did it because he is a better diplomat than the interrupted sessions suggested, and because the situation eventually made the revision unavoidable, but the fact that he did it at all, and the way he did it, mattered. Mirren disclosed the internal dissent within the Solveth delegation, which she did not have to do, and which carried real risk. She did it because she believed transparency would serve the longer-term relationship better than maintaining the fiction of unified opposition. Elder Dresch filed the formal review request. That exposed the Dravik's specific interest in the Northern Access provisions, which they had been careful not to expose throughout the conclave. He did it because the right outcome required it, and because he had decided, based on 3 words and 43 hours of good maintenance service for his vessel, that the risk was acceptable. Delegate Vell and Delegate Poe showed up to the facilitated session together, without being asked to arrive together, because they had decided that their interests were aligned enough to stop being separate about them. None of these people did exactly what we needed them to do because of anything we forced. We did not force anything. We created conditions, and they made choices, and the choices they made were the right ones. That is the other thing about real negotiation, that theory often misses. The outcome depends not just on your preparation, but on the quality of the people across the table from you. We were lucky to be across the table from people who, when the situation made honesty necessary, were capable of it. I was in Cork 2 weeks after returning from Vethprem. My mother made dinner, and we sat at the table she has had since before I was born, at the window that looks out over the bay, and she asked me to tell her about it. I talked for 3 hours. She asked questions. My mother's questions are always better than I expect them to be, which is a thing I should have learned by now, and never stop being slightly surprised by. At the end of it, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Then she said, "Did they ever ask you why you came back?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "After you walked out," she said. "Did anyone ask you why you came back when they invited you?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "No one asked that." "Why did you?" I thought about it more carefully. "Because the problem was solvable," I said, "and because we needed to be part of solving it, not to win. Because the corridor is a real place, with real ships, and real people passing through it, and the question of how it gets managed matters to all of them. Walking out was about creating the conditions for a genuine conversation. Coming back was about having one." My mother nodded slowly. "That is the part that people will miss," she said. "What part?" "That you went back," she said. "Anyone can walk out. The harder thing is coming back with something better than what you left with." I thought about that on the flight home. She was right, as she usually is. Walking out was necessary. It was the move that changed the room. But it was only meaningful because we came back, and because what we came back with was a framework that served everyone better than the one we had left. That is the whole of it, I think. Be in the room as a real participant, or do not be there at all. Know where the door is. Build somewhere worth walking to. When the moment comes, walk. And when you come back with something real. There is a line I keep returning to from the Diplomatic Corps training materials, written by someone who served before the era of interstellar contact, about negotiation in situations where one party is significantly less powerful than the other. It says, "The goal is not to convince the stronger party that you are strong. The goal is to convince them that you are necessary." I kept that line in my briefing notes throughout the conclave. I did not write it on any document that went into the official record. It is not in the field report, but it is in this account. because I think it is the truest single sentence I can offer about what we were doing on Veth Prime for 19 days. We did not try to convince 62 ancient species that humanity was strong. We are not strong by the standards of that room. We never will be, in that specific historical sense, because strength in an interstellar context accumulates over millennia, and we have been in space for less than 50 years. We convinced them that we were necessary. Station Calloway was the mechanism. The patience was the method. The walkout was the moment. The facilitated session was the conversation. The treaty was the result. But the underlying thing, the thing that made all of it possible, was the simple fact that we had built something real in a place that mattered, and we had protected it with the specific combination of legal registration, operational commitment, and strategic positioning that made removing it from our control cost more than including us in the conversation about it. We were necessary. That was enough. Captain Rhea sent me a message last week. The first Corridor Oversight Commission meeting had taken place at Calloway, in the station's conference room, which she had described to me previously as functional, but showing its age. She had apparently decided, sometime in the 2 months since the treaty was signed, to renovate it. The new conference room, her message said, has a view of the corridor through the main observation window. She sent a photograph. The table is oval, which is unusual for a station facility. 8 seats. The council liaison's position is at one end. The Calloway operations representative is at the other. The 6 commission member seats are distributed evenly around the sides. All of them face the window. You can see the stars from every seat. Rhea had written at the bottom of the photograph, "Everyone at the table can see where the ships are going." I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I sent back, "That is exactly right." I want to close with something that happened on the last evening of the conclave, after the treaty was signed, and the reception was over, and the delegations were beginning the process of departure that follows any major gathering of this kind. I was standing outside the conclave facility, waiting for the transport that would take our mission to the departure terminal. Veth Prime's evening was dark by then, the sky showing the deep blue-green that I had grown accustomed to over 19 days. The city's lights were on, spreading out in every direction, 30,000 years of continuous habitation illuminated against the night. Elder Dresch came out of the building a few minutes after I did. He was traveling with a small group, heading in a different direction than our transport, and he paused when he saw me standing there. We looked at each other for a moment, across the few meters of pavement between us. He said, "Ambassador Callan." I said, "Elder Dresch." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Dravik Collective will be watching the implementation of the treaty carefully." "I would expect nothing else," I said. "We will be watching your mission in particular," he said. "Also expected," I said. He made the small sound one final time, the one that his translation device never rendered, the one I had been hearing in various contexts for 19 days and had learned, imperfectly, to read. This time I was fairly confident it meant something like, "Good." "The treaty names 18 protected shipping routes," he said. "The Commission has 3 initial agenda items. The liaison's first report is due in 60 days. He looked at me steadily. "A great deal is going to happen in the next year." "Yes," I said. "You are ready for it." It was not quite a question. "We have been getting ready for a long time," I said. He gave me the slight head inclination I had last seen in the Grand Chamber, and then he walked away with his group toward his transport, and I watched them go until they were out of sight. Then I looked up at the sky one more time. The stars were not visible from inside the city. The light was too strong, but I knew they were there, the way you always know the things are there that you cannot see because you have been paying attention long enough to know they exist. 17 light-years of space, 1 fuel depot, 47 humans, a treaty that had taken 19 days to produce and would take years to implement, and would matter, I believed genuinely, to every species that moved through that region of the galaxy for a very long time. Our transport arrived. I picked up my briefing case and walked toward it, and Owen and Lena and Sam fell in behind me, and we left Veth Prime the way we had arrived, together, with our work still ahead of us, knowing where the door was. Ambassador Nora Callan, Human Diplomatic Mission, Helix Corridor Conclave, Veth Prime, Galactic Archive Reference, HUM DC-7 Calloway. Personal account submitted to the Diplomatic Corps Training Archive. Category: Negotiation under power imbalance. Unconventional leverage. Infrastructure as diplomatic instrument. Status: Required reading. All cohorts. Year 1. They gave us the seat near the door. We made sure the door was worth something. And then we made sure they understood what that meant.